My name is Ray Sickinger. I've been in the Society of St. Vincent de Paul for 27 years. I've served as a conference president. I've served as a district council president. I've served as a diocesan council president and national council member. I've served as a regional VP. I've served as a vice president under Joe Flanagan, and I'm currently on the national board of directors in charge of Goal 4. Goal 4, the strategic goal that I sit on the board and represent. Those things that come under it are systemic change, Voice of the Poor, the Hispanic Latino Initiative, and the Multicultural Diversity Initiative. We're going to take a look at Ozanam and Catholic social thought, a pioneer of Catholic social teaching. Now, you've heard several times already in this conference people saying how Frederic raised the social question. You saw several times the quotation about how he talks about it's no longer a matter of political forms, it's a social question. And so Frederic quickly saw that it's a matter of social issues. In particular, in his time, one of the key social issues was the labor issue, the need for good work, and not only good work, but a living wage for that work. We're going to see some of that. But to set the context, I want to set the context on the 10 principles of Catholic social teaching, because we can't say whether or not Frederic was a pioneer of or represents them or fulfills them unless we have some idea of the principles. Now, some might say, well, wait a minute, where'd you get 10 principles, Ray? I remember the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops saying there's 7 principles. I'm not contradicting the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops, but I'm actually working from a Vincentian framework, because it was Father Bob Maloney, using the thought of another individual I'll be mentioning in just a few moments, who actually defined in an article these 10 principles of Catholic social teaching. Focuses on the human person, the first one. The importance of human life, the second one. The importance of association, the third. Participation, the fourth. Preference for the poor, the fifth. Solidarity, the sixth. Stewardship, the seventh. Subsidiarity, the eighth. Equality, the ninth. And the common good, the 10th. Now, here's the sources. You actually have these. You have all the slides. Robert Maloney, 10 Foundational Principles in Catholic Social Teaching, can be accessed on the web, and that's the web page where it can be accessed. He built on the thought of a man named William J. Byron, which appeared in America magazine in 1998. Both suggested understanding these principles. Well, the only way to do it was by looking at individuals who embody them. That was what they both suggested, Maloney and also Byron. And there is no one who embodies them more than Frederic Ozanam. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take their lead. I'm going to take the lead of Father Maloney and William J. Byron and take an individual and look at Catholic social teaching through the lens of this individual. Now, at the same time, some of you, as I said, are familiar with the Catholic bishops' 7 themes, the USCCB's themes. Life and dignity of the human person, call to family community participation, rights and responsibilities, option for the poor and vulnerable, the dignity of work and rights of workers, solidarity, care for God's creation. Those 7, if you remember the 10 I just mentioned, are obviously incorporated in the others. So it's not that they're different ones, they're incorporated. And as we go along, I'm going to show you how they relate, just simply by showing which ones of the USCCB relate to the framework that both Byron and Maloney set up. Antoine Frederic Ozanam and Catholic Social Teaching. John A. Ryan, a scholar, referred to Ozanam as a great precursor in our modern Catholic social movement. Those were his words. Pope John Paul II, we saw that in a number of presentations already, recognized, acknowledged the contribution of Ozanam. And many others have recognized his role. In fact, one of the most recent and best articles I have read is by Thomas W. O'Brien, Pioneer and Prophet, Frederic Ozanam's Influence on Modern Catholic Social Theory. It appears in Vincentian Heritage, the same journal in which the article I mentioned that I wrote is going to appear in November. And O'Brien particularly looks at Ozanam's thought from a theological perspective and its theological implications, and especially, but not only, focuses on how Ozanam's thought actually anticipates the idea of development of doctrine in the church, along the lines of John Courtney Murray later on. Some very interesting ideas in O'Brien's work, and it's another pioneering work on Ozanam and Catholic social thought that you should be aware of. To begin to understand the framework that I'm trying to start here with Ozanam, it's key to understand that Ozanam was concerned about regeneration of society. He uses that phrase many times in his work. Regeneration of society. This is a picture of Frederic, and this is actually a picture, people think this is a picture of the French Revolution, but this is not. It's a picture of Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People. Delacroix was a famous French painter. It's a liberty leading the people. It's a picture of the 1830 revolution that occurred in France and overthrew the Bourbon monarchy, brought in Louis Philippe, that Ralph mentioned this morning in his presentation. Ozanam, at the time of this revolution, was approximately 17 years old. 17 years old, and he was not at this point in Paris at this point. And what are the source of Ozanam's ideas? How can we look at Catholic social thought and get some sense of what Ozanam said and did and how it relates? The basic sources of his ideas are his scholarly writings, his letters, his lectures, and especially his work with Les Nouvelles, the New Era, that newspaper that was published between 1848 and 1849, and in which he wrote a number of significant articles. We'll use references from some of those to try to understand. And our key task today in this workshop will be to try to understand how Ozanam embodied these principles. How did Frederic Ozanam embody these principles that we just outlined, those 10 principles? And I'm hoping to have time as we go along to not only entertain questions, but have you ask some questions at the end especially. Now notice, the first principle that I mentioned was human dignity, and notice it aligns perfectly with the USCCB's first theme, life and dignity of the human person. According to the Catholic bishops, every human being is created. There we go. According to the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops, every human being is created in the image of God and redeemed by Jesus Christ, and therefore is valuable, worthy of respect as a member of the entire human family. This is reinforced not only by what the Catholic bishops say, you can find it in a number of sources. One example is on the 100th year, Centissimus Annus. The human persons are willed by God. They are imprinted with God's image. And that particular work was written in 1991 by John Paul II. So there's a number of resources within the Church that highlight that U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops' position. How does Frederic relate to that first principle about the human dignity? Well, certainly enough, it has to do with his first admonition, let us go to the poor. Here is Frederic with Emmanuel Bailly and the other members of the first conference, the 7 members of that first conference. Here, in fact, as you go into Paris, there's Saint-Sulpice, and on the side of Saint-Sulpice is the place where they met, and there's a plaque on the wall. That's the plaque you see. It says, here was the first conference formed. It was Ozanam who said we have to go to the poor. And the way we need to go to the poor is the very way St. Vincent de Paul told us to do, with dignity, seeing Christ in them. We should fall at their feet and say, Tu es Dominus et Deus meus. We read that this morning with Bishop Quinn. You are our masters, and we will be your servants. You are for us the sacred images of that God whom we do not see. And not knowing how to love him, otherwise, shall we not love him in your persons? He recognized the dignity of those he served immediately. I've also provided you with the sources of some of these. So oftentimes you see the quotes and you don't know where they come from. So I provided you with some of the sources. This came from a letter to Louis Jaumont. And Louis Jaumont was the one who painted Ozanam as a young man. He was a good friend and he was an artist all of his life. And it wasn't just that quotation. This very famous quotation that comes from his works. It was in his works published in 1848 in Les Nouvelles, Help That Honors and Help That Humiliates. The help that honors. Help honors when to the bread that nourishes, it adds the visit that consoles. When it treats the poor man with respect, not only as an equal, but as a superior, since he's suffering what perhaps we are incapable of suffering, since he is the messenger of God to us. Ozanam understood fully. He understood completely not only the need for the dignity of the human person, he not only understood it, but he lived it. It became a felt passion because it came from a deep experience when he went on home visits and met those people and saw the face of Christ. Principle 2, respect for human life. This dovetails with the USCCB theme of life and dignity of the human person. Every person from the moment of conception to natural death has inherent dignity and a right to life consistent with that dignity. And this is reinforced again, in this case by John the 23rd. In 1963, Pacem Terris, Peace on Earth. We must speak of man's rights. Man has the right to live. He has the right to bodily integrity, to the means necessary for the proper development of life, particularly food, clothing, shelter, medical care, rest, etc. The church is quite clear on this. And Ozanam was quite clear about speaking about rights as well, and about this important aspect of Catholic social thought. Instead of espousing the interests of a doctrinaire ministry, of a fearful peerage, or an egotistical bourgeoisie, we must take care of the needs of the people who have too many needs and not enough rights, and who justly demand a more complete role in public affairs, guarantees for work, and against misery. He wrote that in 1848 to a friend, Théophile Froissart, and they appear in his letters. And he wrote similar things in other pieces that he published. He was very conscious of the importance of the speaking out for rights. At the same time, the dignity of the human person was reinforced in the home visit. The very first home visit Frederic Ozanam made was to a woman who had a number of children, young children. Her husband was a drunkard. She worked hard, but he took her money and he bought drink. The children suffered. The woman suffered. They didn't have their needs met. And the young Ozanam, with another friend, came to visit her. And the first thing he did was listen to her story. The second thing he did, he was a law student studying law. He went to find out what her legal rights were. And he realized she wasn't legally married. So there was no marriage. So she could leave this abusive situation with no qualms of conscience. And so he recommended, he and his friend, that they get a restraining order against the man and get him out of Paris. But instead, they listened to the woman, and she said no. Instead, I could go and live with my relatives, my family, outside of Paris. If it was only for my sons, I don't know what I would do. You know, they're a little bit older. I have the younger ones. And listening to her, they worked together, and what they did was they put the sons in Emmanuel Bailly's printing shops for apprenticeship, for jobs. They got a restraining order that forced the man to stay in Paris, and they got the money for her to travel to her family, and they brought this woman to a sustainable position. That was on the first home visit. It was a systemic change, home visit. a systemic change home visit. And it was done because they worked with the person. They walked with the person, their human dignity, their rights, their right to life, a good life, and they walked with them out of poverty, on that journey out of poverty. This is a beautiful painting, by the way, by Gary Shoemaker. It's owned by the Association of the Miraculous Medal in Perryville, Missouri. They're kind. They've given me rights to use it. They've given Father Ransom rights to use it. In fact, it's the cover of his new book. So they've been very, very kind to allow us to use these pictures. The third principle, the principle of association. This dovetails with the U.S. Catholic Conference Bishops' theme about call to family, community, and participation. And according to the Catholic bishops, our tradition proclaims that the person is not only sacred, has dignity, respect, but is also social. How we organize our society in economics, politics, and law and policy directly affects human dignity and the capacity of individuals to grow in community. So how we structure what we do affects individuals and affects whether or not they can grow and develop as they should. So a person is not only sacred but social. And this kind of idea, even though he lived before the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops published this young man you picture here at the Sorbonne, this is the actual School of Law at the Sorbonne, understood that concept, that the way we organize society directly affects human dignity, and that people have a right to association. This is reinforced again in a number of church documents. One of those most famous is Gaudium et Spes, sometimes known as the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, promulgated by Paul VI in 1965. But God did not create man as a solitary creature, for from the beginning, male and female, he created them. Their companionship produces the primary form of interpersonal communion. For by his innermost nature, man is a social being. And unless he relates to others, he can neither live nor develop his potential. It all depends on relationships, and Ozanam understood throughout his life the importance of relationships. Part or principle 4, participation. The USCCB theme would relate to this, would be number 2, call to family, community, and participation. And according to the U.S. Catholic Conference, we believe people have a right and a duty to participate in society. Notice that key phrase. I love this because I tell this to my students. I ask them, do you have a right to vote? And a number of the students that I teach do have a right to vote at their age. And they'll say yes. I said, do you have a duty to vote? And that generates a lot of discussion. And according to Catholic social thought, you not only have the right to vote, you should and must vote. You have a duty to vote. In fact, I've actually heard one bishop say, and I think he's correct, that if you, for any flagrant reason, do not exercise your right to vote, you're actually committing a sin. You have a duty. So it's a right and a duty to participate in society, seeking together the common good and well-being of all, especially the poor and the vulnerable. And this is reinforced certainly in the Catholic Catechism about responsible citizenship. You can read about that. I've given you that particular quotation. So the principle of participation. What about Ozanam on these two principles? I've mentioned a few things, but what about him on association and participation? These two principles of Catholic social thought. Well, he certainly was a good husband and a great father. We saw that this morning in the presentation, but I can tell you I've read it in his letters. When you read his letters to Emily, and many of you know the letters written by Father Dervin, but I have 6 volumes of Ozanam's letters at home that stacked together would stack at least 18 inches to 20 inches high. He wrote many more letters Dervin was only able to translate a certain number of them and only a small portion of his life and only a small portion of those letters. Reading some of those other letters, especially the ones to Emily, are just absolutely, absolutely mind-blowing. He really loved her dearly, but it's also apparent that she loved him immensely. It was a real match made in heaven. And as far as his little Marie, that gorgeous little daughter that you saw this morning, he was an absolutely doting father. He took his responsibilities seriously, both as husband and as father. He also took his responsibilities seriously in participating in public life. He actually served in the National Guard, especially around the disturbances of 1848. He would become actively involved in politics, as we will see. And he believed that the common people should also be brought more actively into the political process. His own quotations, "The social order exists only in the interest of the human race. They who obey the law were not created for the good pleasure of the lawgiver. On the contrary, the lawgiver was made for their needs." That's directly out of his Dante and Catholic philosophy. And he was an absolutely fabulous scholar on Dante. He was one of the first to show the connection between Dante's poetry and the philosophy of the Middle Ages. So he is a brilliant scholar as well. But in this particular work, he has a number of quotations. This is one of them. The lawgiver was made for the needs of the people, not the opposite way around. I'm not sure we have that straight today. Association and participation. He particularly believed, as I said before, in including the people in democratic government. And this comes from The Correspondent, a journal that he published in. This came in the February of 1848. The revolutions and the troubles were just about breaking out at that point. And he says, look, let us sacrifice our prejudices and turn to democracy. Turn this proletariat, which knows us not, towards democracy. Let us go after it not only with our preaching, but with our benefits. And let us help it not only with our alms, but with our efforts to obtain for it institutions which will set it free and make it better. Let's take this working class, this proletariat, and help that class to be better, to have a better life, to live a better life, to have the benefits that we all enjoy. That's quite radical in 1848. Not just for a Catholic, but for many, to be honest with you. So he understood completely the importance of association and participation, not only for himself, but more importantly for others to actively participate and associate, and that human beings are social beings. Now, he certainly was not unaware of the French Revolution. You have a picture here of the French Revolution. There is that wonderful guillotine. The guillotine, by the way, was invented by Dr. Guillotine. No, he was not. People think that. It was recommended by Dr. Guillotine as a humane form of execution because it was much more effective than the broadsword in execution. And if I'm not mistaken, I think it was into the 1970s that in certain parts of France it was still used as a method of capital punishment, the guillotine. But there's the guillotine. There is the reign of terror. And in fact, pictured on there is the tyrant Robespierre, who is responsible in large part for the reign of terror in the French Revolution, who's also going to the guillotine. For Ozanam, the French Revolution had been bloody and violent because it had forgotten its religious heritage. It wasn't its basic principles. It was because the revolutionaries forgot their basic religious heritage. A Christian heritage that could and should embrace the people in a loving way. And so Ozanam did not reject the ideas of liberty, liberté, equality, égalité, and fraternity, brotherhood, fraternité. No. For Frederic, those catchwords, liberty, equality, fraternity, the catchwords of the French Revolution signaled for him, and these are his actual words, the temporal advent of the gospel. the temporal advent of the gospel. And this is another beautiful mural painting. This actually comes from the priest Siger Köder. It's in the parish hall of St. Vincent de Gras in Austria, and I've been given permission to use it by that parish. And it's absolutely magnificent. It shows Ozanam and the political turmoil of his day, and there he is at the podium teaching, but it's also where he oftentimes brought out both his Christian thought and some of the thoughts about the rights and the needs of the less fortunate. Ozanam would be involved in the elections of 1848. In fact, this morning, Ralph Middlecamp alluded to his platform, his record. We actually have what he stood for. It's actually published, and I've actually seen one of the original copies of what was published when he ran for election in 1848. It's in that souvenir Ozanam, or that museum of Ozanam that he mentioned. My wife Pat and I in March were able to spend 5 hours in that museum, going through the entire museum, taking pictures of all the artifacts and reading all the different documents in there. And what he said in the platform about liberty, I want the sovereignty of the people. And as the people are made up of the universality of free men, I want above all else the sanction of natural rights of man and of family. In the Constitution, one must put above the uncertainty of parliamentary majorities freedom of people, freedom of speech, freedom of teaching, of associations, unions, of religions. And you cannot suspend individual freedom. He's very clear. These rights sound very modern. They certainly ring in the ears of Americans. This was his platform on liberty in 1848. What about his platform on égalité, equality? I want a republican constitution without a return to royalties, which are henceforth impossible. I want it with equality for all, therefore with universal suffrage. Universal suffrage for the National Assembly. I reject the thoughts of a federate republic. But at the same time, I reject an excess amount of centralization, which would enlarge Paris to the detriment of the other departments, the other sections of France. The cities to the detriment of the country. Because he doesn't want inequality to return in any way. He wants everyone to be equal before the law. And his platform on fraternité, brotherhood. I want fraternity with all its consequences, and I've highlighted some of the key things. I will defend the right of the principle of property, so private property. But without touching this foundation of civil order, one can introduce progressive taxation, a system of progressive taxation, which would help to alleviate some of the taxes that have been placed on especially the lower classes. I'll also support the rights to work, the independent work of the laborer, associations of workers, unions. Unions wouldn't even be recognized officially in France until the late 1800s, long after Ozanam had passed away. He was supporting them in the early 1800s. The works of public service works, where people who are unemployed can be put to work in government-related activities. He also wanted measures of justice and foresight which will alleviate the sufferings of the people. In my opinion, all these means are not too much in order to resolve this formidable question of work, the most pressing question of the present time. I wonder if he would say the same thing if he lived today. Probably so. What a platform. Liberty, equality, fraternity. I would have voted for him. Definitely. Principle 5. Preferential option for the poor. In effect, preferential option for the poor comes right out of the Old Testament, out of the Bible, which essentially is founded on the principle that it's not just that those less fortunate should be taken care of by us, they have the right, we have the duty to take care of those less fortunate. And it's very interesting that in Scripture, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger are the three indicated as the less fortunate. We could say today the single mother, the child without parents, and the immigrant. That's what Ozanam would say. And I would dare say that Ozanam would be in support of the rights of all three of those groups based on what I know of Ozanam. According to the U.S. CCB, in a society marred by deepening divisions between rich and poor, our tradition recalls the story of the Last Judgment and instructs us to put the needs of the poor and the vulnerable first. And this has been certainly reinforced in that very famous work on the condition of labor, Rerum Novarum, the encyclical by the very famous by the famous Leo XIII, published in 1891. And in fact, many of Ozanam's ideas had a profound impact on the thinking and the writing of Leo XIII in Rerum Novarum. And in Rerum Novarum, Leo XIII says, when there's a question of defending the rights of the individual, the poor and badly off have a claim to special consideration. The richer class have many ways of shielding themselves, stand less in need of help from the state, whereas the mass of the poor have no resources to fall back on. Ozanam was aware of this, and he was aware of the problems of poverty, a deep insight into poverty. In fact, he once said, we're not going to understand poverty if we simply write about it, think about it, read about it. We understand poverty by feeling the chill that the poor man feels, by walking up into the garret in which he lives. When we do that enough times and experience that, we'll begin to get a handle on this problem of poverty. And therefore, in working with that person in poverty, we will be able to begin to develop some solutions. This is what Ozanam said and stood for. If a greater number of Christians, especially clergymen, he was not easy on the clergy. He wrote to his brother and said, you got to spark your brother priests. If a greater number of Christians, and especially clergymen, had looked after the workers for 10 years, we would be more sure of our future. He wrote that in 1848, encountering some of the pictures of poverty that you see before you right here. These are actual scenes from the Paris of his day. Again on poverty. Take care of the workers like the rich people. It is from now on the only way to salvation for the Church of France. The priests must give up their little bourgeois parishes, flocks of elite people in the middle of an immense population which they do not know. He wrote this to his brother Alphonse, who was a priest. Ozanam understood the problems of poverty. He understood that the church had to be a leader in this. And he understood that the Gospels had called, the Scripture, both the Old Testament and the New Testament, had called for the preferential option for the poor. The sixth principle, the principle of solidarity, it dovetails absolutely with the USCCB theme 4 of solidarity. The late John Paul II explained it so simply. Basically, solidarity is all are responsible for all. It's as simple as that. Now, that sounds simpler than it really is, but that's fundamentally. And USCCB says Catholic social teaching proclaims that we are our brothers and sisters' keepers wherever they live. We're one human family. Learning to practice the virtue of solidarity means learning that loving our neighbor has global dimensions as well. And this is reinforced in the a piece by John Paul II in 1987 on social concerns. Solidarity is not a feeling of vague compassion or shallow distress at the misfortunes of so many people, both near and far. On the contrary, it's a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good, the good of all. One of the most significant letters is a letter from a friend of his named Léonce Carnier. And Carnier is on fire with a suggestion that Frederic made about a network of charity around the world. And Frederic would again reference this concept of seeing beyond just France. You know, initially he was interested in Paris and France, but very quickly he saw the powerful force of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul as a force not just for Paris and for France, but the world. And so I'd like to embrace the whole world in a network of charity. I don't know of any phrase, of any desire, of anything associated with Frederic that puts its finger more on that key concept of solidarity. Frederic really believed that we are all responsible for all. That was his message. That was his lived belief. Principle 7, the principle of stewardship, or in the USCCB theme, they call it the care of God's creation. According to the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops, the Catholic tradition insists that we show our respect for the Creator by our stewardship of creation. Let me just take one moment and remind you of the gospel messages. In fact, recently we had one of the Gospels, Sunday Gospels, was about the stewards. But remember what the scriptural reference to stewards is all about. The steward is not just someone who takes care of the master's goods. Who is the steward that stands out the most? Do you remember from the gospel passage? Which one?
He increased the masters.
Got it. He increased the masters. So the concept of stewardship from a biblical and especially from a Christian standpoint is not just that we take care of things, but that we're going to return back what we have even better than we had it. That's a very powerful concept. And I remind you about that whenever you think of stewardship. I think that's extremely important. We oftentimes, as Christians and Catholics, overlook that side of it. This is certainly emphasized again in John Paul II's 1991 encyclical on the 100th year, Sanctissimus Annus, in his desire to have and to enjoy, rather than to be and to grow. Man consumes the resources of the earth and his own life in an excessive and disordered way. Man thinks that he can make arbitrary use of the earth, subjecting it without restraint to his will, instead of carrying out his role as co-operator with God in the work of creation. Frederic was very conscious of nature and the stewardship of nature. In fact, he looked upon nature in a sacramental way. Nature was sacrament, a sign of God. You see it in a number of his writings. It certainly comes out in the beautiful work he wrote on the Franciscan poets in Italy. Christianity, so often accused of trampling nature underfoot, has alone taught man to respect her, to love her truly, by making apparent the divine plan which upholds her, illumines, and sanctifies her. This man has it. He understands it. Truly, God is not only the great legislator, the great geometrician, he is also the great artist. He decreed that the work of his hands should be good. He also decreed that it should be beautiful. The mountains are all divine. They bear the imprint of the hand that formed them. When this morning, when Michael Theo was talking about Nepal and about the Himalaya mountains, Ozanam would have loved to have seen the Himalaya mountains. He loved mountains. He would have loved that and the power and the grandeur of God. The mountains are all divine. They bear the imprint of the hand that formed them. But what shall I say of the sea? Its grandeur strikes us at once, but we must contemplate it a long time ere recognizing that other ingredient of beauty which it possesses, grace. Grace. This man has a real deep conception of the power of God in nature. Not a romantic view, where a number of the romantic poets of the period that lived with him were pantheists. That's not Frederic. He sees nature as a sacrament, as a sign of God. He admired St. Francis and his love for creation. It was one of the things he loved about St. Francis, the way Francis had a real sense of the linking of all creation together. And in fact, he was a third-order Franciscan. Ozanam was a third-order Franciscan. And then this gives you an idea of how, in his own day, he understood that there was industrial revolution going on, but he also hated some of the things that were being done to nature. There is nothing more savage or more worthy of a barbaric century than these railroads, which do not respect any of the most beautiful things, valleys, mountains, streams, and which fill everything, penetrate everything, which go straight ahead and which are always black, so that this beautiful countryside from Rouen to Paris becomes very monotonous and the most grayish thing in the world. Principle 8, subsidiarity, certainly relates to the call to family, community, and participation. According to the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops, this principle deals chiefly with the responsibilities and limits of government and the essential roles of voluntary associations. Frederic recognized the legitimate role of government in providing help in times of crisis. We see it in some of his lecture notes. But he did not favor big government that interfered unnecessarily and arbitrarily in people's lives. Even within the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, he wanted to reserve to the local conferences their rights to have certain decisions made at that local level. He understood that principle of subsidiarity. And it's reinforced in Economic Justice for All by the Catholic bishops. The principle of subsidiarity states that in order to protect basic justice, government should undertake only those initiatives which exceed the capacity of individuals or private groups acting independently. It defines good government intervention as that which truly helps other social groups contribute to the common good. Frederic would have understood that and certainly could have agreed with it. Principle 9, human equality, dovetails with the U.S. Catholic Conference theme on the dignity in work and rights of workers. Equality of all persons comes from their essential dignity. While differences in talents are a part of God's plan, social and cultural discrimination and fundamental rights are not compatible with God's design. At a very early age, he was absolutely opposed to the treatment of blacks in the Caribbean, the French Caribbean, for example. In human society, one's natural right gives rise to a corresponding duty in other men, the duty that is of recognizing and respecting that right. Hence, to claim one's right and ignore one's duties is like building a house with one hand and tearing it down with the other. Pacem in terris, that we quoted before. And Frederic understood this about equality. I remind you again about his platforms. A Republican Constitution, his statement about equality, universal suffrage, all people being equal, especially the rights that he wanted in his platform on fraternity. I remind you of that again. The rights to work, associations of workers, measures of justice, alleviating the sufferings, resolving the formidable question of work, and treating all people with dignity and respect. Principle 10, the principle of the common good, dovetails with the USCCB's theme of rights and responsibilities. The common good is understood as the social conditions that allow people to reach their full human potential and to realize their human dignity. The social conditions assume respect for the person, the social well-being and development of the group, and the maintenance by public authority of peace and security. It's reinforced in Christianity and social progress. Mater et Magistra, John the 23rd in 1961. As for the state, it has also the duty to protect the rights of all of its people, particularly of its weaker members, the workers, women, and children. It can never be the right of the state to shirk its obligation of working actively for the betterment of the condition of the worker. And certainly on this score, Ozanam was very much in the forefront of workers' rights. Exploitation occurs when the master considers his workers not as a partner, nor even as an assistant, but as an instrument out of which he must extract as much service as possible at the smallest possible price. Yet the exploitation of a man by another man is slavery. The worker machine is nothing more than part of a capital, like the slaves of the ancients. Service becomes servitude. This is from his notes from commercial law. It's actually in his what's called his oeuvre, his works, published in his works after his death. And Frederic favored a just or living wage that would supply the essential necessities of life, provide a pension for old age, allow for the education of the workers' children. He actually supported that. It wasn't a minimum wage. It was a salutary wage, a living wage. And he understood that concept of the common good. I think this quote says everything in reference to his ability to understand that concept. It's up to us to choose to which altar it pleases us to bring it, to what divinity we will consecrate our youth and the time following. In what temple will we assemble at the foot of the idol of egotism, or in the sanctuary of God and humanity? We're going to think only of ourselves, or we're going to think of everyone. Or again, this other quote, egoism and charity are two rival powers which from the beginning have disputed the possession of the world. Egoism is produced under two forms which are very dear to it, despotism and anarchy. Charity in the church opposes liberty to despotism and to anarchy, authority. That comes from two chancellors of England, written by Antoine Frederic Ozanam. So he understood very powerfully, Catholic social thought. I'm going to end my comments and leave us a few minutes for questions again, but I'd like to end with this particular quotation. It's the quotation that I've decided to end the book I'm writing. The title of the book I'm writing is called Love Never Fails, The Life Lessons and Legacy of Frederic Ozanam. And the book ends in this fashion. Frederic Ozanam could perhaps be faulted sometimes for his naivete about politics and entrenched interests. He could perhaps be faulted for thinking that all Catholics and Christians would respond to persistent misery with the same passion he displayed. He could perhaps even be faulted for wearing himself down and damaging his health by taking on too much. But he could neither be faulted nor reproached for the integrity of his principles or his dedication to a cause once he committed to it. He had an incisive mind, a confident soul, but most of all, a tender heart. Frederic Ozanam truly believed in the transformative power of love, and as a consequence, he became a genuine embodiment of 1 Corinthians 13, 4-8. At the time his short life ended, he was patient, he was kind. He did not envy, he did not boast, he was not proud. He did not dishonor others, he was not self-seeking, he was not easily angered, he kept no record of wrongs. He did not delight in evil, but rejoiced with the truth. He always protected, always trusted, always hoped, always persevered. He lived a life of abiding love, was a model of charity, because he knew in his heart, love never fails. Thank you.